There's an attitude about pigs that they're disgusting, they're just dirty creatures, and they kind of just want them dead. And I've talked to people that go helicopter hunting.
There's a reason people in Texas talk about feral hogs with a kind of exhausted anger. Not annoyance, not frustration, anger. Because these animals do not just wander through land, they destroy it, they tear up crops in a single night. They rip irrigation lines out of the ground. They collapse fences, crater pastures, contaminate water sources, and leave behind damage so severe that some ranchers wake up to find months of work erased before sunrise. To most people dealing with them, hogs are not wildlife anymore. They are an invasion, and for decades the solution seemed obvious. Trap them, shoot them, chase them from the air, kill as many as possible, as fast as possible. That became the war in Texas, but then a routine hog eradication mission in Blanco County captured something on infrared footage that stopped experienced wildlife officials cold. Because what the cameras recorded had nothing to do with the hogs themselves. It was not a failed trap. It was not a hunter making a mistake. It was not another field being destroyed. It was something moving in the brush around the hogs. Quietly, deliberately, systematically, and when experts finally understood what they were looking at, the reaction was immediate, because the footage suggested that the entire war on feral hogs may have been aimed at the wrong target from the very beginning. The invasion. The story starts centuries ago. Feral hogs are not native to the United States. They were brought here roughly 500 years ago, first as livestock. Spanish explorers released domestic pigs into unfamiliar territory as a living food supply. The idea was simple enough: leave animals behind, return later, and harvest them when needed. But pigs do not stay where you leave them. They slipped into forests, river bottoms, brush country, and swamps. They adapted, they bred, they spread, then things got worse. In the early 1900s, Eurasian wild boar were imported into parts of the United States for private hunting preserves. These were not barnyard pigs. They were tougher, more aggressive, and built for survival in difficult terrain. And once they escaped captivity, they began breeding with the feral descendants of those earlier domestic pigs. What came out of that crossbreeding was not just another wild animal. It was something more resilient, more intelligent, and more destructive than either one alone. A hybrid built for expansion. And the numbers behind that expansion are hard to even process. A single sow can produce up to 2 litters a year. In good conditions, each litter can contain numerous piglets. Populations can rebound with terrifying speed. Remove one group and another forms. Cut numbers down, and within months, the gap begins closing. That is how the United States ended up with millions of feral hogs. And Texas carries the heaviest burden of all. Across almost the entire state, hogs are there. In cropland, in ranch country, in river corridors, in suburbs, in places where they were expected, and in places where they were never supposed to be. This is no longer a localized wildlife nuisance. It is a statewide occupation, and the animal itself is built like it knows it has the advantage. Feral hogs can run fast. They can jump barriers people assume will stop them. They carry tusks that can rip flesh open in seconds. Older animals develop heavy shielding across the shoulders that makes them harder to bring down cleanly. Miss your shot, and you do not just fail. You educate the hog, and once educated, they become even harder to catch the next time. That is part of what made the problem feel unbeatable. They were not just multiplying, they were learning. The damage. The economic toll is staggering. Texas landowners lose enormous amounts every year to feral hog destruction. Crops disappear overnight. Hay fields are rooted up. Pastures are left looking like they have been shelled. Golf courses, lawns, levees, roadsides, and even infrastructure corridors have all been damaged by rooting and wallowing behavior. And the threat is not only financial. Feral hogs compete with native wildlife. They destroy habitat. They raid nests. They foul streams and stock tanks. They can spread disease to livestock, pets, and humans. In rare but horrifying cases, they have also attacked people. So when ranchers say they want them gone, that anger is not abstract. It comes from watching the same destruction happen again and again while every official solution seems to buy only temporary relief. Which brings us to the old playbook. The failure. For years, the strategy was brute force. Cage traps, corral traps, dog teams, night shooting, helicopter gunning, professional removal crews, government contracts, private hunting pressure, and yes, these methods can remove hogs. Sometimes a lot of hogs. A helicopter team can clear enormous acreage quickly. Traps can capture entire sounders if used correctly. Landowners can make real, visible dents in local populations. But the deeper problem never went away, because removing hogs is not the same as defeating them. In many places, the harder people pushed, the more the animals scattered. Survivors changed movement patterns. They spread into neighboring land. They became trap shy, night shy, human shy. And once those survivors reproduced, the new generation inherited the benefit of that caution, which meant that in practice, many eradication efforts were doing two things at once: reducing numbers in the short term, while teaching the remaining hogs how to avoid removal in the future. That is one reason the math never seemed to work. You could spend huge amounts of money, coordinate operations over massive ranches, remove large numbers of animals, and still watch the population recover with astonishing speed. Conference after conference, study after study, program after program, and the hogs kept spreading. Nobody had solved it. Not ranchers, not the hunting industry, not wildlife agencies, not federal programs. So when the Blanco County footage came in, nobody expected it to challenge the entire logic of the fight, but that is exactly what it did. The footage. The camera was set during a routine operation. Infrared, brush line, night conditions. At first glance, the scene looked ordinary. Hogs in cover, movement around a nesting area. Nothing unusual for Texas land managers used to reviewing hours of nighttime wildlife footage. But then the researchers saw it. Coyotes, not one drifting through, not one scavenging after the fact, not random movement at the edge of the frame. Multiple coyotes, coordinated. The animals were not behaving like opportunists. They were moving with purpose. One stayed low, another circled. A third held position farther out. They were using cover, using spacing, using timing. And most importantly, they were not targeting adult hogs. They were targeting piglets. That was the part that changed everything. Because the standard human strategy had always focused on the adults. The big bodies, the obvious damage makers, the visible problem. But what the footage suggested was that another predator in the system had found a more efficient target entirely. The next generation. Not the hog standing in the field today, the hog that would multiply tomorrow. On the footage, the sequence was brutal and fast. The sow's attention shifted. The piglets scattered. The coyotes struck. One bite, one grab, then back into cover. Seconds, not chaos. Technique. Experts reviewing the footage reportedly replayed it over and over because it did not fit the way most people had been thinking about coyotes. These were supposed to be scavengers, generalists, nuisance predators that picked up easy meals where they could. But this looked different. This looked learned. And once they started looking more closely, researchers began noticing that the Blanco County footage was not an isolated mystery. It was evidence of a pattern. The revelation. In multiple hog-heavy areas, field signs had been showing up for years without a clear explanation. Excavated nesting sites, piglets missing, disturbed bedding areas, evidence of targeted predation that did not match the usual assumptions. Now, with the footage in hand, those scattered signs began to connect. Coyotes were not just occasionally killing piglets by chance. In certain areas, they appeared to be doing it regularly. And that changed the entire strategic picture. Because if you want to slow a fast-breeding invasive species, the most effective target is not always the adult animal tearing up a pasture right now. It is the reproductive pipeline. It is the piglets that never get the chance to mature. That is where the logic of the footage hit like a shockwave. For years, humans had been fighting the problem from the outside with expensive methods that were reactive, intermittent, and often temporary. Meanwhile, a native predator may have been applying pressure from inside the ecosystem the entire time, continuously, silently, and at the exact point where hog populations are most vulnerable. The piglet stage, that was the disturbing thing in the footage. Not that something terrible was happening, but that nature may already have been doing a better job than the official strategy in one crucial area, while people were too focused on the visible war to notice it. The part nobody wanted to admit. If that interpretation was right, then it led to an uncomfortable question. What happens when people kill the very predator applying that pressure? Because for decades, coyotes in many places were treated as pests to be removed, trapped, shot, poisoned, and culled under bounty systems or nuisance control efforts. They were seen as a separate problem. But what if, in hog country, suppressing coyote populations did not help? What if it actually removed one of the only forces naturally limiting piglet survival? That possibility is what made the Blanco County footage so explosive. It implied that wildlife management may have been working against itself. While landowners spent money on traps and helicopters, while agencies funded removals, while hunters worked to clear properties. Another crucial part of the equation may have been erased over and over again. The predator that did not attack the toughest animals. The predator that attacked the future of the population. And once that idea entered the conversation, the old playbook started to crack. The new war. Texas did not suddenly abandon trapping or aerial removal. Far from it. Those methods are still powerful, and when used correctly, they matter. Smart traps now allow landowners to monitor activity in real time and trigger gates remotely only when entire sounders are inside. That matters because partial captures can teach survivors to avoid traps forever. Some ranchers intentionally leave traps open for days or weeks so hogs become comfortable entering. They let entire groups normalize the structure before ever activating it. Then, when the moment is right, they close the gate once and remove everything inside. Helicopter operations are still used too, especially when coordinated across large areas so hogs cannot simply move from one safe property to the next. And in some places, new feeder and bait technologies are being tested with the goal of targeting hogs while protecting non-target wildlife. But the difference now is philosophical. The strategy is no longer just kill every hog you can see. Now the question is, what combination of pressure actually changes the long-term population curve? And that is where the footage matters, because it forced people to think not just about removal, but about reproduction. Not just about the animals in front of them, but about the animals that would have existed 6 months later. In that framework, coyotes stop looking like a side issue. They start looking like part of the system. Maybe not the whole answer, but possibly a critical one. A predator that works every night in every brush line, without fuel, payroll, or flight hours, targeting the exact age class that matters most. That is why the experts reacted the way they did. Not because the footage showed a horror story, but because it showed a solution they had underestimated. The answer in the brush. What the Blanco County footage revealed was not just predation. It revealed blind spots. For years, the war on feral hogs had been framed as a contest between humans and an invasive species. Ranchers versus hogs, helicopters versus hogs, traps versus hogs. But the footage suggested something larger, that the ecosystem itself had been responding, adapting, correcting, quietly. The coyote, dismissed, hunted, reduced to a nuisance in the public mind, may have been doing something nobody gave it credit for. Not wiping out adult hogs, not solving the whole problem overnight, but attacking the problem at the level of replacement, at the level of tomorrow. And once you see that, the story changes. Because the most effective weapon against a destructive invasive species may not be the loudest one. It may not be the helicopter. It may not be the rifle. It may not even be the trap. It may be the native predator already in the brush, doing exactly what evolution trained it to do. That is why those experts reportedly stopped in their tracks when they saw the footage, because they were not watching a side note. They were watching the war rearrange itself in real time. And the most disturbing part was not what the coyotes were doing. It was realizing how long everyone had been looking straight at it without understanding what they were seeing. What the data started showing. After the Blanco County footage circulated through research circles, something subtle began to happen. People started going back through old trail camera archives, back through field notes, back through reports that had been filed, logged, and quietly forgotten. And once they knew what to look for, they started seeing it everywhere. Not always clearly, not always dramatically, but consistently enough that it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Piglet disappearances that had once been written off as unknown loss, disturbed nesting sites that didn't match known predator patterns, short bursts of movement in nighttime footage that had been ignored because they didn't involve adult hogs. Individually, none of it had seemed important. Together, it formed a pattern, and the pattern pointed in the same direction as the Blanco footage. Coyotes were not just present in hog territory. They were interacting with it in a far more deliberate way than anyone had formally accounted for. That realization forced a shift in how researchers began thinking about pressure on hog populations. Because until that moment, almost every model, every funding decision, and every field operation had been built around one assumption. If you want to control hogs, you target the hogs directly. But now there was a second possibility. What if indirect pressure, applied at the right point in the life cycle, mattered more than direct removal? A different kind of math. Think about how most eradication efforts are measured. Number of hogs removed, acres cleared, damage reduced this season. Those are immediate, visible metrics. But population growth does not operate on visibility. It operates on survival rates. If enough piglets survive, the population rebounds. If fewer piglets survive, the curve changes. That is slower, less visible, harder to measure in the moment, but over time it is far more powerful. And that is exactly where the footage pointed. Because every piglet removed before maturity is not just one less hog. It is an entire chain reaction that never happens. No future litters, no learned avoidance behavior passed down, no expansion into new territory. It is subtraction at the source. That is why some researchers began referring to it not as predation, but as leverage. Why it went unnoticed. There's a reason this took so long to recognize. Human attention naturally locks onto the biggest, most visible part of a problem. In this case, that meant adult hogs. They are the ones destroying fields. They are the ones showing up on cameras. They are the ones people encounter face to face. They are the problem you can see. Piglets, on the other hand, exist mostly out of sight, hidden in brush, active in narrow windows of time, vulnerable but not visible. And coyotes operate the same way, low to the ground, often at night, moving quickly, leaving minimal trace. So you had two critical pieces of the system, both operating in the least observed part of the environment. And unless you were specifically looking for that interaction, it passed unnoticed, year after year. What happens next? The footage did not end the hog problem. It did not eliminate the need for traps, aerial control, or coordinated removal efforts. But it did something arguably more important. It widened the frame. It forced wildlife managers, researchers, and landowners to consider that the system they were trying to control was not just reacting to them, it was reacting to itself. And that meant the outcome of the fight might depend not only on how aggressively humans intervened, but on what they chose to preserve. Because once you understand where the real pressure points are, the question changes. It is no longer just, how many hogs can we remove? It becomes, what forces are already shaping this population, and are we helping them or working against them? That is the question the Blanco County footage left behind. And it is the reason those experts did not just study it. They stopped. Because for a moment, they were not watching a problem get worse. They were watching the first clear sign that something, somewhere in the system, might already be pushing back. Quietly, efficiently, and almost completely unnoticed.